Kyiv has forced Moscow into silence. The AFU pierced Russian skies. Air defense failed. The Kremlin certainly didn't expect this. This wave of revenge from our side is unstoppable. Ukraine has crushed the pride of the RF. Epic footage of the rout is in every Russian group. America has declared Kyiv the winner. Trump is finally distancing himself from loser Russia. Total isolation from Moscow. Americans no longer hide who they're betting on. Fedorov gave the signal. Sky defense is changing beyond recognition from this moment. Laser weapons and cruise missiles with artificial intelligence. Ukraine has finally given the green light for arms exports. Our technologies are worth their weight in gold. And all of this happened right now. Hello, I'm Daryna Gutskalo, and we are beginning. Ukraine has finally had the last word. The AFU took such harsh revenge for the attack on Kyiv that Moscow is in full-blown panic. Russians claim they downed a Ukrainian FP-9 ballistic missile near Moscow, the very one propagandists feared.
During the missile alert in the Moscow region, S-300 and 400 systems were active at high altitudes, which is unusual for a drone or cruise missile. Also, a large crater formed at the crash site of the downed object. It's possible this could have been an interception of a Ukrainian ballistic missile.
And here's the most interesting part. Just last week, Firepoint co-founder Denis Shtillerman stated that a Ukrainian ballistic missile capable of reaching Moscow is nearly ready. And now those words have taken on a whole new meaning.
We're currently developing ballistics that will be able to reach both Moscow and St. Petersburg, because Russia is a monocentric country where everything is concentrated in one place, unlike Ukraine. And we have everything. We're currently conducting ground tests of the engine. And in the near future, we'll start flying. That's it. Then we'll be testing the missile on Moscow.
And that's not all. A double dose of fury. Drones attacked an oil refinery in Kistovo, 800 kilometers from the Ukrainian border. Lukoil Nizhegorod Nefteorg Syntez is one of Russia's largest oil refineries. The facility produces gasoline, diesel, and aviation fuel. However, it seems all of that is in the past. Ukraine's defense forces are cutting off nearly the last oil artery of Russia. The refinery has been attacked at least twice in April and May of this year. The strike could indeed be the final one. Foreign analysts don't hide it. There are virtually no unreachable zones for the AFU's weapons.
Ukraine has expanded the range and intensity of its missile strikes on Russian territory, leading to air raid alerts in nearly half of the regions of the world's largest country since the start of the year.
America is increasingly speaking in a language that the Kremlin does not like. The US stated that for the first time since 2023, the AFU are beginning to gain an advantage over the Russian Federation on the battlefield. As a result, the balance of power in the war is gradually shifting in Ukraine's favor.
Today, I would bet more money on the Ukrainians than on the Russians.
Furthermore, Washington now openly admits that Ukraine's successes could seriously influence Donald Trump's future position on supporting Kyiv. Supposedly, the head of the White House really loves winners. And in addition, former Pentagon chief Leon Panetta advised the American leader not to associate with loser Russia.
Putin will not win under any circumstances, Panetta continued. It would be wise if the president chose the side that is going to win this war, and that is Ukraine.
The tone in Washington is noticeably changing, and Moscow is already starting to realize support for Kyiv can only increase. Does this mean that the most difficult stage of the war is beginning for Putin? We are following the developments. Ukrainian air defense could become even stronger. Laser systems are already being tested in Ukraine, which in the future will be able to hunt aerial targets and leave Russian terror without even the slightest chance. Mikhailo Fedorov announced the start of the testing.
We are already testing the laser and already have certain results. We aren't reporting much yet, but the field is actively developing.
The defense minister also stated that a separate priority is the development of low-cost cruise missiles using artificial intelligence technologies. According to him, they could appear in just a year.
This may sound like futuristic projects, but in a year, it will no longer be news. We will be working on this.
And all this against the backdrop of Ukraine launching arms exports. From now on, states participating in the drone deal program that have relevant intergovernmental agreements with official Kyiv will be able to directly sign contracts with Ukrainian manufacturers. The minister emphasized that the Ukrainian defense sector has successfully proven itself in the war and demand for its own developments is growing every day.
Our task is to create conditions under which Ukrainian manufacturers can scale production, open new markets, and attract international investment, without losing the priority of supplying the defense forces.
The swords are already drawn. Japan is sharply increasing its support for Ukraine. Tokyo is entering a new level of assistance, finances, programs, defense solutions. The signal from Asia is becoming clearer. Kyiv will gain another powerful partner who is entering the fight in full force. In Moscow, this is traditionally read with nervousness. The balance of power continues to shift away from the Russians. It seems that retribution is converting into double strength. What blow Takechi is preparing for Putin for dessert, you must be the first to hear it. The end of the era of silence. The Japanese dragon has awakened. For a long time, Japan was a quiet giant for the world. A powerful economy, huge money, but a complete refusal of a military role due to a pacifist constitution. But the full-scale invasion of the Russian Federation into Ukraine in 2022 undermined this peaceful world. Tokyo realized that if the mad beast is not stopped in Europe, tomorrow the flames will engulf Asia. Today we see a fatal turnaround for the Kremlin. Japan enters the game as a steel partner of Ukraine, understanding that Kyiv and Tokyo are fighting one battle for survival. Numbers speak louder than words. Japan has already invested over $15 billion in Ukraine, ranking 6th in the world among donors. But the real shock for the Kremlin is a new package for 2026 in the amount of $6 billion. This was stated by the Vice Speaker of the Verkhovna Rada, Olena Kondratyuk. Kyiv has already received from Tokyo over 2,500 electric generators, over 65 transformers, 10 generator units, and other critical equipment to support and restore the energy system. $6 billion is almost 40% of all aid from previous years combined. Tokyo is no longer just helping the Ukrainian economy survive, but is investing in systemic security, purchasing radars, demining machines, and high-tech equipment that puts our army ahead above the occupiers. But the main revolution is taking place in the laws. Until recently, Japan prohibited the supply of tanks, artillery, missiles, ships, and aircraft, the so-called 5 categories. But already in the first half of 2026, these restrictions will be lifted. In February of this year, NATO representatives stated that Japan plans to join the Pearl Initiative to support Ukraine. This opens the way for systematic supplies of dual-use equipment, from secure communication systems and cyber defense to powerful radar complexes that can blind the enemy for hundreds of kilometers.
Going beyond the supply of specific materials, it is worth considering a broader dimension of Japanese participation, the transfer of technology, know-how, and institutional practices. Japan has accumulated unique competence in several areas directly relevant to Ukraine's needs.
But this is not a one-way game. Tokyo is vitally interested in the unique combat experience that Ukraine gains every day, using the latest systems in the conditions of a real war. This technological alliance transforms support from humanitarian to partnership. But there is one problem, or rather a thorn in Tokyo's side, and that is Moscow. Tokyo is going on the hunt. The country has openly declared a threat from the Russian Federation. The Minister of Defense has dealt a crushing blow to diplomacy. The war in Ukraine is a direct attack on Japan's security. The reason has surfaced. The DPRK is sending its military to the front with the Russians to gain hellish combat experience and technology.
The war in Ukraine is not somewhere far away. There, North Korean military personnel are studying new ways of fighting, with drones, artificial intelligence, in cyberspace, and with traditional weapons. When they return to North Korea, the question arises, exactly what will this experience be used for and against whom?
The minister is in a rage. It is vital for Japan to uncover the secret motives of Kim Jong-un and Putin, as this military alliance is turning East Asia into a powder keg ready to explode at any second. But revenge for Russia has already been prepared. The Kremlin is trapped by soft power. The Japanese government is launching a plan for the quiet annexation of the Kurils through the economy. Tokyo has offered Moscow a detailed scheme to seize the initiative on the islands, from full control over ecology to remote medicine from Hokkaido. It is envisioned that Japanese doctors could consult both patients and local Russian medics, including online. Russian and Japanese private companies, in Tokyo's view, could organize sea cruises for Japanese tourists to some islands of the southern Kurils. The Japanese authorities also expect that ecologists from both countries could work together on environmental preservation. Russia seems to be losing its exclusive right to the islands under the guise of cooperation. But that's not all. In the field of fishing, Japan is preparing a hook for Moscow that is impossible to refuse. Joint fish processing and a lightning-fast takeover of the seafood market. Tokyo is effectively taking the island's resources for itself. And here Moscow should be worried because all these steps by Tokyo regarding the Kurils are obviously not accidental. Japan has officially confirmed the Kuril Islands are occupied territory that the USSR illegally seized. The Russian Federation considers the islands part of the Sakhalin region, while the Japanese authorities include them in the Nemuro district of Hokkaido Prefecture. The chief cabinet secretary of the Japanese government once again declared the extension of Japan's sovereignty to these islands.
The northern territories are islands over which our country's sovereignty extends, the inherent territory of our state. The position of the Japanese government has not changed. The subject of negotiations for a peace treaty is the territorial ownership of the 4 islands. This is the consistent position of our country.
Moscow is shaking. Nikolai Patrushev has been seized by a real hysteria. Putin's aide sees Tokyo's actions as preparation for a full-scale return of the territories by force. He is shouting about new territorial claims that will finish off Russia. According to Patrushev, Tokyo is allegedly driven by a thirst for profit. The Japanese need the vast wealth of Russia's mineral resources and the bioresources of the Kurils. Fear has big eyes.
Japan is preparing the ground for making new territorial claims, specifically in the waters of the seas surrounding Russia, which directly affects the interest of the Russian Federation in the sphere of national security.
He added that there is nothing to discuss, the islands are ours, but immediately admitted Japan has built a powerful fleet and together with NATO is preparing for revenge. Pacifism has been thrown into the trash. Tokyo is moving towards an aggressive policy of revenge. Patrushev revealed a terrible secret. NATO plans to use the Japanese fleet as a battering ram to destroy enemies all over the world. Legislative bans on war are about to be lifted. The samurai are going on the hunt. Japan has officially made a choice, and that choice is Ukraine. Moscow's blackmail over the Kurils and North Korea's nuclear threats have only hardened Tokyo's resolve. Samurai endurance has been replaced by decisive action. With a record military budget and a new defense industry strategy, Japan is becoming a steel shield in the east, leaving Russia and its allies no chance for revenge. The Kremlin wanted to isolate Ukraine, but as a result, it got its most powerful opponent, a reborn Great Japan. The worse things go for Russia at the front, the louder the Kremlin's propaganda screams. Losses are mounting, logistics are crumbling, and every kilometer costs the occupiers an extremely high price. That's why Moscow is so desperately inventing new successes. But lately, its victories only live until they collide with reality. Ukraine has finally managed to turn the tide. All the details on this, don't miss it, coming up next. In Russia, they have already invented a new kind of military victory. Run in, wave a flag in front of the camera, and you can report a successful offensive to Putin. However, this time the show ended much faster than the Russian propagandists could enjoy their own headlines. In the Zaporizhzhia direction, the occupiers solemnly announced the alleged capture of Novoselivka and Huliapilske, and propagandists have already started talking about another major breakthrough by the Russian army. However, this entire grand operation fit into a short video and a few loud headlines. The scenario was simple. A group of Russian stormtroopers ran to the outskirts of the settlements, unfurled the tricolor, recorded the necessary footage, and were clearly already preparing to receive applause from their superiors. In Moscow offices, they were probably already opening champagne, and propaganda channels were rushing to paint another historic victory. But once again, a small problem arose between the video and the real situation at the front, reality. As soon as the cameras were turned off, a completely different story began. Ukrainian drones targeted the liberators, and the entire loud victory performance instantly turned into an operation to eliminate its participants. One of the occupiers, who just minutes ago was posing with a flag for Russian news, ended up in Ukrainian captivity. This is becoming the signature style of the Russian army: first paint a victory and only then face what is actually happening on the battlefield. While Kremlin propagandists count imaginary successes, the Ukrainian military counts the very real results of their work. And the louder Moscow shouts about its triumphs, the more often it turns out that this entire victory ended before the propaganda segment was even finished. And this is far from the only case where the Russian authorities substitute reality with beautiful fairy tales. Putin himself has personally joined in this process. During his latest statements, he painted an incredibly rosy picture of the Russian offensive. However, the facts and frontline maps tell a different story. The master of the Kremlin stated that in the Lyman area, the occupiers only have 149 houses left to liberate out of over 11,000. It sounds formidable, but the problem is that most of the city remains under the control of the defense forces, and Russian assault groups only occasionally seep into certain areas of the eastern part of the city. In other words, the distance between Putin's words and reality is no less than the distance between Kremlin dreams and their actual results. Statements about Slovyansk and Sumy look no less interesting. The Kremlin says that Russian troops are only 8 to 9 kilometers away from Slovyansk, although the actual distance is about twice as far. The situation with Sumy is no better. Putin speaks of 10 kilometers to the city, while in reality it is 17 to 20 kilometers, and the front line there has barely changed for months. The story of the alleged breakthrough of the impregnable Ukrainian defense line near Dobropilya sounded particularly fantastic. Putin even hurried to announce that there are almost no Ukrainian fortifications beyond the city. However, in practice, Russian units are still tens of kilometers away from the lines he is talking about. It turns out that the Kremlin is already celebrating the overcoming of defenses that its troops have not even reached yet. And the real gem was the statement about the almost completed encirclement of a large Ukrainian grouping near Rubtsi. According to Putin, only a few kilometers remain until the circle is complete. However, even a basic look at the map shows that there are still about 10 kilometers between the Russian positions and the area supposedly on the verge of encirclement. It seems the Russian leadership has long been fighting on two fronts at once. On one real front, where progress comes at a huge cost and does not always bring results. On the second television front, where you can capture cities, encircle armies, and break through defenses with one stroke of a pointer on a map. And while propaganda counts fictional kilometers and non-existent victories, the front continues to stubbornly remind the Kremlin that reality works a bit differently. However, if we are talking about Russian fantasies, the story of the flag in Zaporizhzhia or Putin's latest statements about a successful offensive is just a small episode in a much larger performance. In fact, the Kremlin has been painting a victory over Donbas for the fourth year in a row, and every time the result is the same. Loud promises, formidable deadlines, and yet another postponement of the dates. The president of Ukraine also pointed this out. According to Volodymyr Zelensky, since the start of the full-scale war, the Russian leadership has set a date for the total capture of the Donetsk region at least 15 times.
Russia's political leadership is constantly obsessed with Donbas. 15 times already they've had this delusion that they would completely seize Donbas. In 2022, the deadlines were March 31st, then May 9th, June 1st, September 15th, and December 31st. In 2023, Putin set two more deadlines for the capture of Donbas, by March 1st, and then, when that failed again, it was moved to December 31st. In 2024, there were two such deadlines again. In 2025, when the Russians tried to convince President Trump that Ukraine would supposedly fall, there were three deadlines, by September 1st, December 1st, and December 25th.
After such a list, it's hard to tell what Russia's main military operation actually is, the assaults on the front or the regular rescheduling of deadlines. It seems the only thing the occupiers have managed to take full control of over these years is their own calendar. They've captured Donbas so many times that they should have reached not just Kramatorsk but Mars by now. But every time, stubborn reality shattered the Kremlin's presentations. It's especially funny that even in 2026 this performance continues. At first, Moscow dreamed of settling the Donetsk issue by March 31st. Then the deadline was quietly pushed back to September 1st. Now the new target is December 31st, and there's little doubt if nothing changes, by year's end Russian propaganda will solemnly announce another very near victory that just needs to be postponed a bit.
If Russia doesn't end its war, they'll have to push back this deadline once again. If Putin wants to sacrifice another million of his soldiers to keep banging against this wall, then the million Russians not yet mobilized into the army, who are arguing in gas lines, should think about what awaits them next.
And here the main question arises. If in 4.5 years of war the Kremlin has almost captured Donbas 15 times, hasn't this whole story become the greatest series of broken promises in modern military history? Because while Russian officials draw new arrows on maps and invent new dates for their victories, the front stubbornly continues to remind them of one unpleasant thing: the gap between TV and reality is only getting wider.
Crimea no longer looks like Putin's safe haven. On the peninsula, what the bunker dweller himself refused to believe is beginning. It's a completely different story. Fuel shortages, nervous decisions by the occupation authorities, and strange activity at strategic sites point to one thing: a new reality that TV somehow refuses to show. Russians are looking for megaphones to shout to Putin with a plea to stop the war. And here in the Kremlin, they know full well that the situation is quickly spiraling out of control. What will happen next? Don't miss these shocking forecasts.
It seems that in Crimea they've begun preparing for what is forbidden to speak of out loud. While Russian officials continue to assure the population that the situation on the peninsula is fully under control, behind the scenes, events are unfolding that look more like preparations for a massive escape. According to Russian sources, a plan for the partial evacuation of the population and members of the occupation administration has already been developed in occupied Crimea. The most interesting part is that all of this is happening without cameras or loud announcements, but in a mode of maximum secrecy. At the end of June, armed men began arriving en masse at Crimean oil depots, effectively taking the facilities under their control. Representatives of the owners were kicked out, enterprises were put on a special work schedule, and any questions were answered with classified orders from the occupation authorities. According to available information, we are talking about the possible evacuation of up to 250,000 people. And this no longer looks like a simple bureaucratic precaution. That's the population of an entire large city. The only problem is that even the organizers themselves don't yet understand where to put such a large number of people if this plan is launched. For years, the Kremlin has sold Russians the image of Crimea as a fortress protected forever. Wow, they're hauling them, boys, they're hauling them, a resort that is supposedly far from any danger. But when the authorities start secretly preparing transport, fuel reserves, and evacuation scenarios, there's a feeling that in the offices of the occupation administration, they view the future with much more anxiety than they let on TV. And in general, one gets the impression that Crimea has begun to live according to a completely different scenario than the one painted in Moscow. While some officials are thinking about evacuation, others have suddenly faced another problem. The peninsula is simply running out of fuel, and the consequences are already hitting more than just motorists. Due to the shortage of gasoline and diesel, farms are starting to shut down, which means that not just logistics or transport are at risk, but the future harvest and the food supply of the peninsula itself. The crisis hit Crimea just as the harvesting campaign and vegetable planting are underway. Instead of working normally, farmers are forced to travel hundreds of kilometers to the Krasnodar region and transport gasoline and diesel themselves in canisters. In effect, one of the key sectors of the peninsula's economy is moving into survival mode. What outrages farmers most isn't even the shortage itself, but that the occupation authorities promised to provide agricultural producers with fuel. They promised, but they didn't deliver. Meanwhile, farms are left with loans, contracts, and obligations for the supply of products. Fulfilling them without fuel is becoming increasingly difficult. The consequences are already starting to hit the pockets of Russians themselves. The cost of delivering feed and other products from Russian territory has increased several times over. Producers are openly warning, all additional costs will inevitably be included in the final price of goods. So, ordinary consumers will have to pay for the fuel crisis. And it seems the Crimean fuel crisis is no longer just a local issue for the peninsula, but a symptom of a much larger disease. Because while farmers search for gas across the entire Krasnodar region, and the occupation authorities talk about temporary difficulties, in Russia itself, they've started discussing a solution that would have seemed impossible just a few years ago. It seems the fuel problems there are already so serious that the authorities are ready to pull from the archives something they themselves abandoned over 10 years ago. According to Russian media, the government is considering bringing Euro 2 standard gasoline back to the market, the very fuel whose sale was banned in Russia back in 2013. Back then, officials spoke of modernization, environmental standards, and technological development. And now it seems they have to carry out modernization in the opposite direction. Formally, everything is explained by the need to support the market. In reality, after a series of strikes on oil refining infrastructure and regular disruptions in fuel production, the Kremlin is increasingly desperate to find ways to close the deficit. And while Russia used to boast about modern oil refining capacities, now it's ready to release fuel that was considered obsolete even in the last decade. Euro 2 allows for significantly simplified gasoline production, less refining, fewer technological processes, and lower quality requirements. In simple terms, if there's not enough modern fuel, you can just lower the standards and declare the problem solved. However, there is one very inconvenient detail. Experts explicitly warned that for a significant portion of modern cars, such fuel could pose a risk. So, while officials report on the stabilization of the situation, car owners may face completely different consequences. The most interesting thing is that the Kremlin continues to act as if nothing special is happening. But when a country simultaneously prepares evacuation scenarios, urgently seeks ways to plug fuel gaps, and brings back decade-old standards, it's very hard to call that a sign of confidence. Rather, on the contrary, it looks like an attempt to hold together a system at any cost, where problems accumulate much faster than official propaganda can invent excuses for them. And on that note, we conclude our broadcast. We're continuing right now. Stay tuned for the latest events so we can be the first to tell you. Don't forget to subscribe. See you!